Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick. With me is Evan. Well, Evan, hello, sir.
Hey, how we doing,
Uh,
sir?
Not too bad, not too bad. We'll pull back the curtain. We record these, four at a time, so we're on the fourth of the four episodes here. So
Yeah,
hopefully, we've got enough gusto to keep moving forward.
I think we got it.
I think so too. Real quick, we are going to be covering content in Genesis 1, verses 27 and 28. So I will read those. We won't be, exhaustive in covering that, but our, our themes will come from those two verses. And it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the living thing, over every living thing that moves on the earth. Alrighty. So uh, we want to focus here first, real quick, on this idea of, and so he created them male and female, he created them. And we'll get into, because it doesn't even begin to hint here as to why he created male and female, right? Um, and for good reason. I think we'll get into why he created male and female more in the future. But it's highlighted here for a very specific reason, right? He had no reason to say, he could have just said, and so he created humanity, right? He didn't have to say, he created them both male and female. And I think it's important to recognize that, because what is being said there is that gender has no effect on this idea of being called to play a part in being God's image on earth.
Mm-hmm.
There's no distinction between gender as far as fulfilling that role.
Mm-hmm.
Um, More specifically, if we look at human history and the way things have been applied, there is no preference to the male, right?
Yeah.
Which is often how we see things portrayed. That is not the case here. There's no preference, there's no deference to the male, none of that. It is exactly even when it comes to being called to fulfill that role. And it's important to understand, we'll get more into this here as we get into Genesis 2 and 3, but the Hebrew term Adam, it means simply humanity. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just the male half, right, of humanity. It doesn't mean just men. Adam means humanity as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Or can mean that, I guess. It can mean several different things. Sort of depends on what is surrounding it and what
Yeah.
prepositions lead into it and whatnot. But here specifically, the Adam is a reference to humanity as a whole.
Well, I think it's important too to reference that we introduce God as creator. That's what we said, is that God is first, the first introduction we receive is creator. And so we would assume that if man is in God's image, creator is potentially a function of humanity. That might be an aspect of what it means to bear God's image. Well, in a lot of creation myths, the creator is a female.
Mm-hmm.
So it also makes it is significant to note that there's not, even for obvious reasons, a creator is considered female, because females give birth.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that aspect too, it's a little bit subversive to the ancient idea that feminine is creative, female is to be creative, but male and female are both created in this image of God, and so they're both
Right.
intended to bear that. I
Right.
understand the historical preference, that's also pulled from further our later
Yep.
stories in Genesis,
We'll get
that
there.
lead to the image of male superiority, but also the ancient idea of the female being the creative power or instinct. It's gender neutral in terms of what is to be an image bearer, which
Yeah,
further supports the plurality too.
it does. And it actually, you're bringing that up, makes it actually sound as though perhaps the Christian preference to the masculine, to the male, I guess, throughout history, it could be seen as an overreaction, right?
Mhm.
To that earlier understanding.
Mhm.
And in a way that makes some sense, since we know too that sort of a lot of early tribes, early, human ancestors, kind of prehistorical, may very well have been matriarchal,
Mhm.
uh, because thanks to a lack of dedicated partnerships, something akin to marriage.
Mhm.
You at times, the only way to really trace a bloodline was through the matriarchy, because
Mhm.
you didn't know who the father was.
Mhm.
That was not uncommon. And
Mhm.
so, in a sense, while we can look at this and say, yeah, this is about a balanced perspective, right? And the scales being even. An ancient would have maybe looked at it as not being a balanced perspective, it being an elevation of the masculine, and perhaps, we have continued on in that over elevation of the male,
Mhm.
beyond this, whereas it was really meant to be just a leveling of it and making it even.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. From our perspective, we have to read back and say, now pay attention to the fact that the
the context
the
of the day.
female is significant.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. So yeah, it's interesting what's revolutionary based on that. Whereas in reality, it appears that the message coming through the text is that both are image bearers.
yes, yes.
Both equally bear the
Bear
image,
the image. Yep.
and that gets to our other idea we've talked about in our past episode, talking about the plurality of image bearing.
Right.
But it is significant that both
Do
equally
that.
bear
Yeah.
the image and serve that responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's combined. They make up the image of God. It's not one or the other. They have to work together, and we'll get more into that as we go on.
Yeah.
And then lastly, too, before we get into some larger parts of this command God gives, God does say, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And this will recognize as the same command he gave to the animals. Once again, I will say that this is a command that still stands, right? At no point did God say, stop doing this, stop being fruitful, stop multiplying, stop filling the earth, right? This was never negated at some point,
Yeah.
as we'll see with some later laws and instructions and those kind of things that are later negated. And that, so we have this duty to procreation, right? That struck me, actually, when I sort of recognized this a few months back, where I was like, wow, this is interesting that this is the first command God directly says, to man. And it got me thinking about myself and my own situation. We've had 2 kids, and we talked about stopping at 2 kids, and now we very much are wanting to go beyond that. I think in part, at least for me, it's actually because of this realization, and saying, oh no, that's actually what we're called to do. And we have 2 kids, which actually, if we think about it, that's not multiplying. We're at replacement level, right? With 2 kids. It's when you go beyond that you're now actually multiplying. That's the point at which we would actually be, fulfilling this command, in a sense. So yeah, it just struck me that it's like, here's the first command to us, and it's one that still stands.
Well, there's
And
this. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think of the opposite of that impetus to procreate. I think of people who are saying the opposite thing. What I hear have heard frequently from people in personal conversations, and also generally through the internet, is people saying, I am afraid to bring a child into the world. I'm afraid to what doing that will either, you have the environmental fear of we're bringing in too many people.
Well, what are you bringing them into?
Which I understand, yes, but then even more so, yeah, what are you bringing into? What are you exposing them to? Which I think is one of the things that comes with bearing children is the responsibility to bring up a human who's going to function properly in this, in being an image bearer of God. And so, as you say, like, I'm nervous about bringing humanity into this world. I'm bringing children into this world. It's like, well, what do you think that means to bring children? Do you think you're supposed to bring children into the world and just make sure they have food until they're of a reasonable age where they can get their own food, like, and shelter and those necessities? Or are you viewing bringing children into the world as the responsibility of introducing a human into what they are? And
well, that's why be fruitful comes first.
I don't want to go too far with this, because we can get into various ideas, but I look at parents nowadays. This steps into controversial territory, but it's all right. We'll go there. I look at parents stepping into viewing transgenderism as being, I want my child to choose their gender from the time they are 3 years or 4 years or 5 years old. Or I want my child to, let's say other things. I want my child to choose their own faith or choose their own religion. I don't want to tell them anything. And it's like, well, don't you understand that bearing children is meant to, you're intended to guide them in directions, and this can be done incorrectly very easily, but that is a responsibility implicit, and then be fruitful and multiply, is you are bringing people up into being image bearers. And this, I am afraid of having children, I mean, that's, that is antagonistic to this command. This command is saying, no, you are intended for the responsibility of bringing up children. And that's not referencing people who can't have children and all of those various other things around it. What we're talking about is the person who says, I don't want that responsibility. I am afraid of that responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's what you're being called to.
Yeah. I mean, I think I do think that's why fruitful comes first, right? It's not just multiply, it's fruitfully multiply, and giving that guidance, offering that guidance is fruitfully multiplying, and it's I mean, to you have this strange sense where it's like, I'm going to remove the guidance and remove all of that. The being fruitful, precedes the multiplication. And so there's a sense in which, for me, the delay in having kids would have been based around this idea of but can I do it fruitfully, And in a sense, part of me definitely wishes I hadn't waited as long as we had to have kids. And there's ways in which it's like, but I just don't know how I could have managed it earlier. But at the same time, it's you sort of realize you do, it's like, oh, I could have had them earlier because I would have found a way to manage it, because that's what I did when we finally had kids. You figured out a way, and you just find out a way to do it. So in a sense, if you have that desire to be fruitful, you'll find ways, and you won't be perfect, obviously. No parent is, no human is, but the concern that I couldn't do it fruitfully was not something I needed to be so worried about. In a way, and that's I think that is part of what is wrapped into this verse, is the point that no, if you have a desire to be fruitful, you will, and it's so many people, I think, bring kids into the world now without that perspective. It's almost it's a I don't even know where the desire comes from in some ways, because there are people who seem to want to invest so little into being a parent. It's almost like you why did you take this up in the first place? Like, did you, because of what you thought you would get out of it? Because that's not the reason to do it, and I feel like I see that somewhat at this point.
Well, and there's this I feel like I put the cart before the horse in talking about this, because there's a second half: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over.
Which we will get to
And so
that. Yeah.
we
Yeah.
will, but I don't want to reference what that means. I do want to reference what that means in relation to be fruitful and multiply. It means that the be fruitful and multiply has an intentionality behind it, which is different than what the animals were given. The animals were instructed to be fruit, or let me make sure I'm right. I think it was the fish of the sea, birds of the earth,
yes,
birds of the heavens. They were instructed to be fruitful and multiply with nothing else attached to it. And so understanding that the point of the multiplication is subduing the earth and having dominion over it is the easiest way that I can conceptualize it is assuming a post of responsibility, you know, and that these things are going to outnumber you because I told them to be fruitful and multiply. So you have to keep up with them in order to try and have any hope of having dominion over top of them. Well, that means that you can't. Your goal is to not have weak links. And so if you are being fruitful and multiplying and raising children up, you are intending to raise them in a way that they can then assume the post of responsibility of whatever it is that they're supposed to take over in the collective, responsibility that we all have to have dominion over the earth. And so it isn't just you have to spit out the baby, you know, like you have, once that baby is born, you have the responsibility of directing them in order to be able to achieve some particular goal.
And there's
and the deference to the choice of the child in a lot of cases, and then the fear of doing that is a sign of drifting, I think.
The deference to the choice of the child too, I think, stems somewhat from this sense that people say they want their kids to be happy, right? And that be the thing that they are, that's like the goal of parenting is, so, well, I'm raising my kids so that they'll be happy and have a happy life and whatnot. And I'm sorry, happiness doesn't come up here, you know, like that's not the point of parenting. You know, it is to create others that are capable of bearing the image of God. And when you have the goal be the happiness of your child, you see how things could devolve to the point where it's like getting down to choosing gender, you know, moment by moment too, even, you know, it's like, it's not even a thing that is, you know, well, you pick one and then you stick with it. We now have this weird idea where it's like, well, one day I wake up and I'm this, and by the afternoon I'm this other thing, you know? And, but that is, to me, built in this sort of pursuit of happiness, frankly. And that is very much not what we're sort of called to in this framework here, this idea of being the image bearer of God. It's not about happiness, it's about duty. And so when you're raising your kids, you don't raise them to pursue happiness, you don't raise them so that they might be happy. You raise them to a sense of duty. And if you're concerned about their happiness, then what you need to be doing is teaching them how to be happy in fulfilling their duty, right? Teach them to take joy and happiness in bearing the image of God. Don't seek whatever they think will make them happy. And it's outside the scope of this verse here, but I think, you know, you and I would probably be comfortable making the argument and saying that, no, you won't be happy unless you're doing this, unless you're fulfilling this role of bearing the image of God, of playing this role in this, you know, humanity being the image of God. You won't really find true happiness in anything other than that. And so really, if you want to parent well and you want your kid to find happiness, this is the pathway to that happiness. This is the path to joy. This is the path to being, you know, Paul in the prison, singing songs and just being utterly joyful, you know, because he's fulfilling that duty. And again, that's beyond what this passage is saying. But if we could bring in our own thinking on it a little bit, you know, that is
Yeah, I think happiness isn't referenced, and happiness isn't. I can't think of a place within the context of the Old Testament. I can't think of a place, let me say, in Genesis where the word happy is used. And maybe when we go through it, we're going to come up with a place. I think it's a vague term.
Oh no,
I don't think it's a
extremely so,
really
yeah.
proper
Yeah.
term. And I think
I
people would
hate the term,
say
but
that.
yeah.
But what I do believe is that this is establishing purpose. And I
Right.
think frequently, I think one of the things that is a major contributor to depression's complicated, and there's a lot that goes into it, but purposelessness is something that a lot of that most of humanity faces. And this very initially establishes purpose for humanity. And in bringing up a child, understanding that you bring them up purposefully and that you should be acting, I'm counting like a German, I don't normally do that, you should be acting like a active guide.
For audio only listeners, we're talking about going thumb first, then forefinger, because that's really weird to the audio listener. Wait, did he say Ein zwei?
Yeah, I'm counting with my hand like a German. I'm not counting. It switched randomly to German there. I don't know German. Secondly, if you have a significant purpose that you're doing with which you're bringing up the child, but also that you act as a guide. That's what I feel is missing. Is that you're intended to guide your child in the right direction. You're not just a passive listener to your child. And children,
I guess,
when done properly, children are looking for something to live up to. And that is, if we're going to say the word happy, that gets closer to an approximation of what we're talking of what happiness might be. Being able to have a significant purpose that you're living up to, and it allows you to bear difficulty and the pains that come inherently in life in order to achieve that. And that's what's being presented here.
I guess what I'm saying is that I think, even in the sense that some people believe they can guide their child or are trying to, that they're not, utterly uninvolved or whatever, they feel that their goal is to guide their kid towards happiness. And I guess I could be of two minds in that sense, right? Yeah, if you're deriving happiness from, what I believe is the only true source of happiness, which is fulfilling this purpose, as you brought up, I think that was a good term, this purpose of fulfilling the image of God, then yes, then that is the right thing to guide them towards. But too often, I think we view happiness as this sort of like this fleeting sensation of pleasure, basically. And that, I think that's the issue. I think too often people are sort of guiding their kids towards pleasure rather than this sort of meaningful, purpose-driven sense of happiness that we're discussing here. And really,
it's a potential.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I think that's a potential generalization.
No, I
because I know
sure
people who
yes,
are like that, but oftentimes I would contend with the more complex case. I think the more complex case is potentially the person who doesn't view happiness that way. They might view happiness as a little bit more short-sighted, or even the person who says that I don't want to have children. They don't say because I'm concerned about whether my children will be happy. They're concerned about whether it's morally responsible, right, environmentally maybe, or whether it's morally responsible to bring a child into a world that is this corrupted or this poor, or whether they're up for the responsibility of bringing them up. And it's like, well, don't you know that you're supposed to bring the children into the world in order to, this sounds cliched, but in order to improve it, you're supposed to bring them up, and you're supposed to be creating humans who can more responsibly take care of it.
Yeah, there is far too much of a Malthusian sense of bearing children, and for I guess for listeners who aren't aware, Robert Malthus.
Malthus.
Yeah. Robert Malthus had this economic theory, which was the idea that very soon the population would expand to the point there wouldn't be enough corn to feed them,
Mm-hmm.
and so we would die of starvation and whatnot. And this is the way in which humans
When did Thomas Malthus? When did he live?
It's Thomas Robert Malthus or Robert Thomas Malthus.
An old
I'm not
English
sure
name.
Yeah,
Whatever.
yeah. It was a three name. But it is Robert and Thomas. I just can't remember which one comes first. This was this before Adam Smith?
I believe it was in the 1700s, if I'm remembering correctly. But
yeah, and
just
Adam
you might want to give
was,
them an idea, because there are a lot of people who would say, well, that sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah,
I would say, oh, that sounds like that could have taken place in 2004 or whatever, but this was about 200 years ago.
Well, yeah, this was somewhere between the 17th century and the 19th century. This was essentially this same line of thinking is the thinking of the most recent Avengers villain, Ultron.
Yeah,
Ultron. No, Thanos. Thank you. Gee,
I've sworn off superhero movies, so I don't know.
Okay, well, Thanos in the most recent Avengers movie, well, both movies, wants to get rid of half of humanity because of this concern. Not humanity, just it's universe wide, right? Half of all living things in the universe, because he's concerned about the resources and that they're a drain on resources, right? And so this was essentially the argument that Malthus was making 200 plus years earlier. And this is that is, I think, the sense in which a lot of people think. And we talked about this when we talked about animals a couple episodes back, 2 or 3 episodes back, and the idea that this has happened where animals develop to the point where they then, there's too many of them, or maybe this was even off air. So it was off air. There's too many of them, and they exhaust their own food supply and essentially disappear because of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Malthus's concern was that humans would do the same thing, and it's been shown to be the utter opposite, right? Mm-hmm. That as humans have expanded, as populations have grown, we're more well-fed than ever before.
Yeah.
And that is because of human ingenuity and the fact that we're innovative and come up with solutions and do those things, and we create. And one would argue perhaps that is the reasons we do that and we're able to survive is ways in which we continue to bear the image of God within creation. He creates and then we continue that creative process. But yeah, you need to understand that is what you're doing when you're having kids, is you're actually propelling this process forward, and you will, some of you at least, will bring forth humans who contribute to better and wiser use of resources and better off for humanity and the world as a whole and everyone as a whole. And instead, I think we have too much Malthusian thinking, in the sense that we see, well, if I bring another kid into this world, I'm contributing to the problem, right? Which is what Malthus would have told you were doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So so we have a duty to fruitfully multiply is what it comes down to. And it's important that humanity as a whole recognize this, and it's interesting that it's not specifically defined here what exactly it means to be fruitful, and one could argue maybe as the rest of the Bible goes on, it's sort of describing that, in a sense, what it means to be fruitful. But in a way, we might look at it and say that the fact that God doesn't give us the answer to exactly what that means to fruitfully multiply is that sort of part of the process, right? Is discovering what that is. And it might not be the same in every context. Just like for the animal, there are times at which, and this is something we can understand and they can't, is there are times at which it's not good for them to multiply. It will be unfruitful, in terms of their multiplication. So you have a wolf, population that expands too much and wipes out local other forms of animals, which would eventually exhaust their own food supply chain and lead to there being fewer wolves, as they expand. And so we've seen, that kind of management, wildlife management, occur in places, Alaska and whatnot. And there's a reason for that. It's for the preservation of that species as well as other ones. So there is some sense of discovery of what that means to fruitfully multiply, which we see, of course, described in the rest of this command too, in terms of subduing the earth and all that. We'll get into that as well. But so a point being, though, this command still stands, and so you should be multiplying, I guess. That's something we are called to do. And so if you can, you should. And that has, advanced my thinking, in terms of, it being on the fence in terms of wanting to have more kids or not. Really actually thinking about this, honestly, pushed me over the edge in terms of that definitely should do that while I can, for sure. So, all right. Well, that is it for this one. We'll dive further in on the day, quote unquote, as we know, we're not thinking of these as literal 24-hour periods, but the day in which humanity is created. We've still got a ways to go. There's a lot packed into this one day, so we'll get more into that next time. And until then, like, subscribe, review, comment, all the usual deals wherever you are. Tell a friend if you think this might interest them. We never mention that. And email us at unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you soon.